Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here on a very busy weekend with all the things happening this time of year. Those of you in academia, I know, are also dealing with deadlines and all of that. So thanks for taking part of your Saturday to be with us. My name is Brian Manternach. I use he, him pronouns, and I teach at the University of Utah in the Department of Theater. And I'm also a research associate at the Utah Center for Vocology. So it's my privilege to talk with all of you today, and we'll get to know Kari a little bit, and we'll talk about her book. So I first really got to know the book. Well, I've known Kari for a few years, and I first got to know the book because I am a columnist for Classical Singer magazine, and I write a book review column called The Singer's Library. And so Plural Publishing sent me a copy of the book, and of course I loved it, which I think all of you did as well, which is why you're here. So I did an interview article with Kari, and I also liked it enough that in our Northern Utah chapter of the National Association of Teachers of Singing, we do a book club every year. Well, every year, 2 years in a row now, but we're going to continue it. And so this book as our featured project. Um, and so we read a couple of chapters every month or every other month, got together over Zoom just to have discussions about what we were reading, talk about our practical applications that we've been using in our studios. So that was a great opportunity to dig in. I would encourage those of you who have NATS chapters or just like-minded friends to take on a similar project. I think we get out of academia and out of degree programs, and sometimes we forget that we can create our own professional development opportunities. And it also then, when we were like, well, let's get together with Kari and talk about the book, it coincided with the 2-year anniversary of the release of the book. And as Kari pointed out to me earlier, she didn't really get to have a book launch because it launched right at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was shutting down. So maybe this can be like an unofficial hurrah for 2 years.
It's funny, Brian, some of the pictures or some of the video was done after, because I was just finishing some of the video examples that sit on the website of the Plural Publishing. And so we were doing it at the university in a really pretty Breachman Hall, and suddenly had to figure out how to pivot, and people were doing it from their home, not with the great mics. And anyway, so all that's kind of documented in the book in some way, capturing the beginning of COVID. You can see the inconsistency of some of the recordings that are on there.
Yeah, way back when we were still figuring all of that out.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, that was very early, very early.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I think you all are familiar with Kari from the bio in the back of the book, but some highlights here. She was, of course, an Indiana University graduate where many of the world's finest musicians are trained. I'm slightly biased. Doctorate from the University of Washington, where she still works in affiliation with the laryngology program as a singing voice specialist, but is primarily a private voice teacher in the Seattle area. She was a master teacher for the NATS intern program just a year or two ago. It was
last year.
The first in-person one again after the year off.
Yes.
Great. She was a winner of the Van Lawrence Fellowship. You probably recognize her as the host of the NATS Chat interview series, and she's presented all over the world at conferences and symposia, as well as publishing numerous articles. So as we engage in our discussion today, it's a small enough group. We can, if you want to unmute or raise your hand if you have a question, you're also welcome to put anything in the chat as we just continue discussing elements of the book. I would welcome you also to put in the chat what you felt to be maybe the most useful elements of the book, your favorite parts that you found most applicable in your work as a teacher and or singer. And then one trick, one technique I guess I've learned from one of my favorite interviewers is called Beyond the Bio, where we dig in a little bit more about what's not necessarily in the academic bios that we see printed in journals and on websites. So Kari, I'd love to hear from you just a little bit about your musical upbringing. Who were your early musical influences? When did you start to think that music might be a professional track for you as opposed to just something to do for fun?
Gosh, you're turning the tables. I always ask the Beyond the Bio at the beginning of NATS chats. I got that from Mary, isn't it Mary Saunders Barton and Norm's book, I think, that used that beyond the bio. So I thank them for being able to steal that. Well, my earliest memory of singing having some kind of impact was a group of kids driving with their teacher. I think we were in 3rd grade, and we were headed to some Saturday event, a learning event, and we were all singing "You Are My Sunshine." And I remember at some point, everyone stopped and said, "We want to just listen to you sing." I don't know, I have no idea how accurate that memory is, but I very much remember the car and the song and that sense of being recognized or something, I think. My mom actually has a letter from my 1st grade teacher that said something about my music abilities and that I should pursue a career in it. She found that, I don't know, sometime in the last 10 years. And I thought that was interesting. But so my earliest memories are simply of singing and feeling recognized. And, when you're young, when you feel seen, there's something quite remarkable about that experience. And so I think I followed the breadcrumbs to having praise, to being affirmed in some way. I think I just followed that. And then I was in the choirs, in elementary school and middle school and high school. And I just knew that I didn't know what that meant. I've come from a very small town. We had a lovely music program, and I started studying voice in 8th grade. But I had never seen an opera, and I went off to a liberal arts school here in Seattle, Washington, called Pacific Lutheran, because that was where my choir director went that I loved. So I followed her to, her path, and happened to be Dr. Marie Skonis, who was a very, very famous choral conductor, and Choir of the West was very, very well known back then. And so I got into that choir. So I just followed that path, but I'd never seen an opera and had declared vocal performance major my freshman year, and did not see an opera till probably 2nd semester of my freshman year. Wow. So I was just kind of naively following something that felt right to me.
I love that. Following the breadcrumbs. We get led, we get encouraged, we have teachers and family that support it, and then you look back years later and it's like, I guess that's how I got there.
Yes, I was very lucky. I had parents who always supported. I also showed quarter horses. I was very active in that in junior high and high school. And I was very lucky to have parents who supported what I loved to do. I feel, and helped make opportunities for me.
Yeah. Well, we have that in common. I love that. So I have several questions that I'm going to delve into, but again, I welcome anyone to raise your hand or type questions in the chat. The first one is also sort of related to background, because obviously the techniques, the approach, the systematic approach that you talk about in the book was developed over years of teaching experience. And you even said you had a large pool of guinea pigs to work with to test out some of these exercises. So at what point did you start to think that maybe you had something unique, worth sharing, that maybe others could benefit from as well?
Great question. I think that as I began to understand more about fact-based or functional teaching, and as I say in the book, I really credit Scott McCoy's book with that. I mean, I have a master's degree from Indiana, and I, of course, was required to take a PED class, and we used Ralph Appelman's book. And if anybody knows that book, I talked about it on the Nats Chat Sunday. It is a dense book, fabulous, but dense. And as a young aspiring opera singer, certainly not something I was interested in or felt the need to know about. The great irony of my life, I think, is that I could be heard standing in the hallways at IU saying, "Oh yeah, Richard Miller, he's that science guy. We don't need to know that." Right? That's the great irony of my life, I feel. And I remember saying that. So it was then when I'd been teaching since I was 19 years old. And I shouldn't have probably been teaching then. In fact, I'm certain I shouldn't have, but a teacher connected me with a high school, and I did when I was in college. I then came across Scott McCoy's book right when it was published. And I thought, oh my goodness, we have fact-based information. Somehow I had missed that the first many years of my teaching and singing because I wasn't interested in the ped class at IU. And so when I came across that book, I just suddenly things started to come together, because I remember having conversations with my colleagues at IU about, well, how does your teacher teach breathing? And how does your teacher teach breathing? And I was always looking for the answer and realizing that different people approached it differently. And that seemed interesting to me. So what I loved about Scott McCoy's, or still love about his book, is that it presents these facts. It lays out what we need to know as singing teachers. It doesn't go too deep, but it goes deep, and without kind of preconceived notions of methodology or bias, I feel like. And so from there, I thought, wow, here are some tools that I can just roll into what my instincts and my experience. So that is, yeah. So I guess from that, Brian, to answer your question after that preamble, is really that I realized that the clearer I got about my teaching, and also that was, I have to say, so informed by working with the medical team as a singing voice specialist, because of the way they talk systematically, right? In those books, how systematic. And so it became clear, these 5 voice systems, the mechanics of the voice, really 4. Registration gets rolled into phonation. They don't talk about registration in speech. But I just realized the clearer I got about teaching that way through my own lens, and then I would start to say to the student something with more specificity through that lens. And then as I taught at the university, the singers that studied with me that were teaching said, my goodness, that systematic approach really has made me a better teacher. So it was just from that. And the book really came about, I thought, for 2 reasons. Somewhat of a love letter to my students, that in one place they would have the things that I tend to say over and over again, and they would have a document of that. And I wouldn't, and also self-preservation, I wouldn't have to repeat myself so much, or there would be a way that they, outside of the lesson, could get more specificity about what I was talking about without me having to take as much lesson time. Because I think we have to be careful. We all know motor learning theory. We have to be careful how much we talk in a lesson and how much we're letting them sing and practice. And so that's really how the book came about, as a result of those events coming together.
Good. I have a follow-up to that, but I think before I can get there, I think we have to talk a little bit about the evidence-based voice pedagogy model.
Okay.
So I think, for those of us who follow NATS circles especially, I think the name Kari Ragan is synonymous with NATS chats, with vocal cool down exercises, which is Lawrence research.
Yeah.
And then now the systematic approach, but also the idea of evidence-based voice pedagogy, which you have explored more thoroughly in the Journal of Singing. I've seen you present on it at various conferences, but there's very little about it in the book. It's sort of presented at the beginning and then maybe referenced, but it's not an EBVP book so much as a systematic. Was that a matter of
that's interesting.
Timing as to kind of when you were developing that model, or was that intentional? You didn't want that to overwhelm the book?
Oh, that's so interesting. No, I think timing, because EBVP came about so quickly in 2018. Was that when we were at USC?
I think that's right.
Yeah, and that came about so quickly. And then, of course, I started the book right after that. That fall. So I think that's so interesting that that questioned. To me, EBVP is inherent in teaching. It's inherent in how I want us all to teach. And I guess it wouldn't have occurred to me to explore it in the book because I published that article. What has happened with EBVP since that time, though, is the expansion of it with my brilliant colleagues. So Lynn Maxfield, your dear friend and colleague, helped me to expand the voice research component. Ken Bozeman helped me expand the teacher expertise and experience. And there's an article coming out with Lynn Helding and I on the student goals and perspectives. So that EBVP has really been expanded thanks to their brilliance. And those are newer articles. They've just come out in the last few months, and one still is in press. And we'll be presenting on it over in Vienna this summer as well.
Wonderful.
But yeah, so I think it's more of, because it's separate to me from the systematic approach was really for me about helping singers and teachers get very clear about the mechanics and the cueing of the mechanics in application. And EBVP is more of a broad voice teacher perspective approach to lessons.
Yeah.
But maybe I expand it in the future, Brian. That's in the book. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, second edition. Here we go. My follow-up then from before is, one of the benefits that I find of the systematic approach is that if you are kind of following the progression of the book and working on these things, then you're really getting to all of the techniques related to those 5 subsystems of voice with every student, as opposed to just kind of dealing with whatever particular inefficiency you see in a student who shows up. And so it's obviously we want to address what we see, but we can spend so much area or so much time and so much focus on one area of their singing that we can maybe neglect other areas. So my question has to do with how to reconcile that with the student goals and perspectives. If you're trying, that's the part of EBVP. It's still not easier to say.
It'll come.
Because that recognizes that we have to, as the teacher, acknowledge what the student wants, what the student's goals are. And so if a student, for instance, comes in with the goal of, I want to sing higher and louder, and you're like, and they want all the exercises to be addressed to that, how do you make sure that they're also singing with balanced phonation and that their respiratory system is functioning efficiently and all of that in a lesson setting?
I love that. So yes, I follow their rabbit trail most of the time. And when I teach practicums, I talk about that a lot. If, let's say, you're sitting back and listening to students sing a song, or maybe in their check-in, I always do a check-in at the beginning of every lesson. How's the voice feel? What have you been focusing on technically, artistically? And so I listen attentively to what that is, because I want to follow their rabbit hole for the day. Now, I might have my own agenda, and let's say then they sing and they've said something about the high notes have been up for them this week. That's being higher and louder is where they're focused. Unless I see something or hear something that really is such a separate issue that needs to be addressed before we can get to that, my agenda is irrelevant at that point. So I want to follow what is up for them. So then I'll find a way to engage through each system, right? Each system is required to sing high and loud. So we're going to talk about airflow. We're going to look at articulatory structures. We're going to think about resonances depending on what aesthetic they're singing in. So every system is going to be analyzed from my perspective in order to respond to what their goal is that day, singing louder and higher. So our goals meet always. But if there is 2 things up, and I was like, I think I want to work on this, but I can tell they want to work on that, I follow them without a doubt, because I think that we want their buy-in. And, we know that the more they have a say in the process, the more of a buy-in we get.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I was reading something recently that talked about, just asking them what exercise they like, or they want to start with, or they want to do, or do they want to do this pattern or that pattern, apparently changes their dynamic and their level of engagement and interest in a very profound way. So gone are the days. I know, Brian, because you and I come from a similar background, right? We wouldn't have asked questions in our lessons that much. right? We shut up and we did what we were told, right? And I don't mean that disrespectfully to our teachers. There was a tradition of teaching that we come from, but we are not our teachers the same as our teachers were anymore. So, so we have to evolve with that. So I hope that answers that question. I can do both. I think we can do
Right.
both.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many areas. It doesn't have to be an either or. So I loved your answer. It's very much a student-centered approach. We obviously have to deal with what we're seeing, but we also want them to be able to guide and direct.
Yeah.
The buy-in, as you say, obviously a huge component of motor learning. Learning can't occur if a student isn't first of all engaged.
That's right.
To actually be engaged. And as we know from, I think I first read about it in Tietze and Verlini about the nonlinear system, right? The singing system is nonlinear. So you can address one thing and you can't really isolate those five systems of five.
That's right.
They interact with each other.
That's right.
So you could still be working on your own hidden agenda of overall efficiency while still working towards the student goals.
That's right.
Yeah.
They do. I say that there's a quote in the book. I don't remember what it is, but something about if you change one system, you change the whole, that system and the whole. And that's where sometimes I think people think, how can you think one system at a time? Of course, no. But I do think in our intellectualizing of it, we can think through one system and what vocal tasks or what vocal exercises will facilitate a change within that one system, knowing that you'll impact, if you're working articulatory system, you're going to impact downstream systems. If you're working respiratory system, you're going to impact upstream systems. But I think that it helps us to enter in so that we don't just go into a practice room to practice and go, okay, well, this is what we did in my, I remember this feeling in my lesson, but not remembering what the cueing was to make that change that I had in that lesson and repeat it. To me, there has to be something more concrete than just some recollection of a sensation of an experience, a moment in a lesson. Yeah. And so that's where I want them to feel empowered. Right. In their own practice process.
Great. Yeah, I love that you just brought that up, the sensation and the memory of sensation, because you spend a lot of time in the exercises on the kinesthetic singing tools, I think is what you call them, yep. Implements, whatever. Yep. So yep. Straws, the exercise balls, the flow ball. Oh yeah, the mask. I have my own right here as well.
Don't you love it?
I do.
It is transformative.
Oh, it's my favorite SOVT.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, kind of going back to motor learning theory, some of it there can be a warning against using implements like that because a student could become dependent on them and they can't make the sound without it. So so how do you balance that, trying to give them a sensation to experience that they can then recreate without the use of the implement?
Yeah. And is there research about people becoming dependent? I would love to explore that more.
Yeah, I don't want to miss a tribute, but I remember hearing Lynn Helding specifically talking about, and she uses them,
Yes.
Straws for sure. But there's a point where we have to make sure that we're weaning so it doesn't become only make this sound if I'm using this thing.
It's funny. I have a funny story about that. The breathing belt, the Futuro breathing belt that you wear, that's in chapter 1. It's actually a Futuro surgical and abdominal support post-surgery. But my beloved teacher, Ellen Fall, when I first started studying with her after IU, she had me buy one of those. And she said, people that are littler just have a harder time feeling their breath. And I wore that under every performance gown and every audition dress for probably a year. I did not sing a note without that on my body. And there was a lesson where she said, Kari, you need to take it off. I want you to sing without it. And I remember this visceral reaction. And I tell my students all the time, it was like Linus with his blanket. No, you can't take this from me. I just still to this day remember that visceral reaction to taking that off. So maybe I had it on too long, actually, to serve your point there. But So I would say that this is my answer for that. I absolutely adore kinesthetic singing tools. I don't think they're tricks. I know people think things like that are tricks. I find that ridiculous. What athlete doesn't have different tools to help condition and train their motor skills? So I don't understand that. And we as singers don't have something like a ball to visualize the outcome. You know, if we made an ugly sound and people in the audience would plug their ears, we'd have some visible feedback for our singing, but we don't have that luxury of a ball or falling off a balance beam or whatever.
Mm.
So I think the kinesthetic singing tools are so useful also for this heuristic approach, where when the singers are away from me, they have something more concrete that I know that if they're using a straw correctly, of course, that the chances are that they're going to be conditioning efficiency more likely than not. So I think the answer is student dependent. I think that they should come back to them frequently. So I would say this: if you're working with them, you work with them, you pull them off. But during their practice session, maybe bless you, whoever sneeze, bless you. You know, if they're using it in a practice session, maybe at first it's 5 minutes and maybe it's just 30 seconds for a straw, and then they get on with their singing. Maybe they come off the tools. I don't think you should ever come off SOVTs, to be honest with you. I think you can always use those. But let's say the gauze. I think it's pretty evident when you use it regularly for a few months and that motor skill acquisition is coming along, and you use it less frequently and less frequently, but probably once a year. If you're going to, I call it recalibrating the systems. I think that we are constantly recalibrating as our voice grows, as we age, right? As our Fach changes, as we switch genres. If we've come off a sickness and we're coming back online, I think every single one of those opportunities provides a chance to go back, recalibrate the voice. Using the kinesthetic tools will most likely help to do that. And the other thing is, I had a student several years ago at Aspen who was listening to all the singers talk about their singing technique and how people should sing bigger and fuller or this or that. And she got really pulled off her game, both technically and emotionally, and called me. And I said, you know, get back in the practice room, get out your tools, and get back to baseline. Find baseline before you then start exploring bigger, warmer, whatever you're being told to do. You've got to know where baseline is, what I call baseline. And I think that the tools help us to find that. So it's not I know that's not a super specific answer to your question. It's not like 3 months and then they're off of them. I think that I would suggest pulling them in frequently, and that frequency depends on your circumstances.
Yeah, I love that baseline, the idea of recalibration. I use those terms too,
Mhm.
to kind of get back to, especially, you know, if they've had heavy singing days, or if
Right.
I find when students are coming out of a role, you know, where they've had to sing a specific repertoire over and over and over again in a specific way, to kind of, okay, you needed this for that, but now let's go back and explore some of the other sounds that you still have available. And I
Love
think, yeah, some of these tools can really be used to get them back into the fullness of their voice.
that. Mm-hmm.
So this gets us kind of into you know, the kinesthetic understanding, and so that students can recreate things. The idea of teaching students how to practice, developing greater independence, which you say very early on in the book is one of the main goals. Is the teachers really teach students how to practice, because they're going to spend way more time with their voices than we are. So was that kind of an undercurrent of the systematic approach? I'm thinking particularly in comparison to maybe a methodology, a more fixed methodology, where maybe some of the steps are, uh, or there might be an impression that the steps are more prescribed, as opposed to giving the student the freedom to say, here's what I want to work on in my voice. Here are some exercises that can address that, but I am also free to deviate from those exercises and morph them to what I need on a given day.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple thoughts about that. I looked up the word methodology because it's the first line. I think it ended up in chapter 1, the first sentence of my book is that this book is not a methodology. That I don't advocate a particular methodology. I just have such a visceral reaction to that idea of a methodology. And so methodology means, I looked at it as a procedure, technique, or way of doing something, especially in accordance with a definitive plan. And I just think we're working with humans and we're working with singers with great variability every day. It's one of the things I talk to the singers a lot about. They get down on themselves if they're having a bad day. And no, sometimes you wake up and you feel great and you think, oh, I'm going to have a great workout at the gym. And then you get to the gym and 10 minutes into the elliptical, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be one of those workouts. I didn't expect that. And I think it's even more variable in singing because the voice, our instrument lives in our body. So what we've eaten, our emotional state, our fatigue, if we've had reflux, if we had a fight with somebody, if we're whatever, all of that lives in the larynx, unfortunately. And so I think that we have to accept that there's variability. So to answer your question as far as the methodology, I really feel so strongly that I stand on the shoulders of all the incredible pedagogues of the last centuries, from Garcia and even previous forward, who have done all the work to put out there about anatomy, physiology. I didn't discover any of that. Right? I just have used that information to create this. I didn't even create a systematic approach, right? People have been talking about the systems of the voice for decades. I didn't make anything up, but I've used that information and talked about it as an approach to teaching singing. And I hadn't seen that kind of specificity of when you're listening to somebody, listen through the 5 systems, listen and look through the 5 systems so that you can enter in through a system to devise a change. And so I think that's what I thought would be of use. Take me back to there was kind of a couple parts to that question. One was about a methodology that I wanted to answer, but there was something else you asked.
Teaching students how to practice.
Yeah. And there was one other part to that, Brian, that you so eloquently asked.
So eloquent, I forgot.
What number was that?
That was down on 7. So when
Yeah,
know the purpose of an exercise, how they can guide themselves, it might be related.
that was it. Thank you. Yeah. So I think, yes, they have to understand. I want the students to always know the intention. And back to our conversation about, we would never have asked our teacher, why am I doing this exercise, right? Yeah. But I say to them, at any point, you should be able to ask your teacher, what is the purpose of this? Why are you doing this for me right now in this moment today? And what is the intent? What is the purpose? What is all of that? What is the cueing? I think that they should know that. Now, again, I don't think you have to go into a pedagogical explanation with great detail, but I think you can give them enough of cueing and information to help with that. And so then I want to empower them when they're practicing to be thinking, okay, I've done a 5-note E exercise with my thumb under my tongue. That's how I start. Let's mix it up. Let's do some kind of E pattern that moves faster or is a whole octave right? So I want them to know that the intent of an E in the middle voice is to check in that the tongue is not recruiting. This is for a classical aesthetic. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I'm ready for something more. What might that be?
Right.
So that it's always, an evolving circumstance. My Miss Fall, ironically, Miss Fall, I worked with her for 20 years. We did the same exercises and I have them written. She's written them down. I have them. I treasure them. I still use a lot of them. I've evolved some of them, but that is how I vocalize every day. And there was something in that that was wonderful, in that I could assess my voice daily because I was so familiar with these exercises. But we know for motor learning, random practice, right? We're supposed to mix it up a little bit. So, you know, I can see two sides to that coin, but I think that you can have a set that you like to do to assess your voice every day. But I do want my students to have permission. And conversely, not just if they're feeling better and they want more difficult, but let's say they're feeling vocally fatigued that day. How might they take one of their favorite exercises and modify it to get benefits rather than pushing a boulder up a hill? They can find benefits by simplifying it. And that comes from working as an SVS. You're constantly, you know, sometimes we start with a single note with a singer. We work from one best note and that's it. And so it comes from that work a lot. I hope that, did that answer your question a bit?
It did.
I want to empower them though.
Right, empower. Or allow them to step into the power that they already possess.
Oh, look at you. That's fabulous.
Someone has, it's not my own. I stole it from someone else. It's like, I don't like empower because it seems like you're giving them power, but they already possess power. We're just allowing them to step into it.
Oh, I've never thought of that. That's interesting. It's a good distinction though.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's important.
Well, let's go a slightly different direction here. One of the things that Plural does, the Plural Publishing does, is they assign reviewers to books that can be involved in the process, providing feedback before works are published. So first of all, I'd like to know a little bit about that, just because for my own information, I don't know how that process works.
Dramatically, it was dramatic, but go ahead.
Sure, yeah. And it's in here, you know, it's in the early pages of the book, and so you see the list of, you know, very reputable voice professionals from lots of areas who had to essentially give feedback on the manuscript. So, but one of the people is Robert Edwin, who many folks probably know from his longtime column in the Journal of Singing. And I think it's interesting because he talks, the interview that he did for So You Want to Sing CCM, Matt Hoke edited that, published by Roman Littlefield. And he talks about the shuns of voice, the TION, shuns. Yep. And so he lists, you know, the main elements of singing. He has 8 of them. He talks about body position, respiration, audiation, phonation, registration, resonation, articulation, and emotion. And then, of course, our friend and colleague Lynn Helding, one of her central ideas is to put forth cognition as the third, and neuroscience as the third pillar of voice pedagogy. You know, anatomy and physiology one, vocal acoustics the second, and, you know, making a very strong and convincing argument that we should also include cognition. And so when you were putting this together, you settled on 5 systems of voice production, and already acknowledged that, you know, at least in speakers, something like registration could be wrapped up into phonation. You know, I know some people just narrow it down to the big 3 of respiration, phonation, and resonance. So how did you decide how to narrow that down? How to give just those 5 specific, since you could have numbered it so many different ways?
It wasn't even a decision. That question is so interesting to me, because I thought, well, wait, isn't it always the 5 systems in singing? I don't consider the others systems of the voice, you know, and let me back up one step. For sure, I talk about the 3 pillars with from Lynn. That to me is voice pedagogy. So that to me falls under the umbrella of what is voice pedagogy: anatomy, physiology, acoustics, cognition. For me, the systematic approach is about the systems of the singing voice, and that was informed by the medical working with the medical team, that is what they're looking at, that is what they consider subsystems. So it wouldn't have occurred to me to go another direction. Interestingly, emotion, of course, that to me would be wrapped up in artistry. Alignment and such would be wrapped up into respiration in some way. I guess phonation too, because it impacts that. So those other things are periphery that either are wrapped in or a separate kind of component of being a singer, but not the mechanics of the voice. So that was, and I have to give Robert credit. I think I heard him 15 years ago at least now, talk about the shuns of singing. And that was probably one of the first people that got me thinking about, the shuns, the systems of singing. And he would have said back then, respiration, phonation, registration, articulation, resonation. So he's augmented that now to other directions. But for me, the mechanics of the voice are those subsystems.
Yeah, that's helpful. So tell me about this review process, the feedback.
That may be more of an uncensored conversation off camera. It was traumatizing. I mean, it took a bottle of wine and some phone calls to people I trusted dearly. And it was all actually, I was bracing myself for it. And I remember reading it and actually having tears of relief and joy. People were so kind, really, really kind. So actually, to be fair, my first reaction was, I remember sitting there with tears streaming down my face with the kindness that was given to me. Then there were a couple that just, we're voice teachers, we bristle. So I bristled at a couple, people misunderstanding, thinking I needed to give credit to thinking I was certified in somebody else's method and I needed to give them credit, and I'm not at all certified in that method. And, so things like that I thought, what else would I want to share? Mostly though, I have to say they were really kind. And there were I went through every single one of them and then went with my manuscript. And if they commented on, people were generous with their feedback. Really generous. And so it changed. The feedback absolutely informed the book. I can't remember specifically now a major change, but there were a couple major changes as a result of their feedback. A couple mistakes that were caught where I had mislabeled intraoral pressure. It had used the wrong direction. So actually in hindsight, I was actually very, very deeply grateful because their generosity was extensive.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We're never gonna please everyone. And
No.
I think I feel like everyone who reads the book is probably going to learn something new, but also feel validated in something that they already do. And so it's just where that falls on certain issues, is going to vary from person to person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we have roughly 15 minutes or so. So again, welcome questions from anyone if they'd like to hear Kari answer a question or just talk more about something from the book that you'd like to hear discussed in more detail. We sort of jokingly talked about the second edition, but it's not really a joke because I know all the authors I've talked with, as soon as you publish something, it's immediately out of date because there's something else that could have gone in, or there's another study that informs, our approach to some aspect. So I know Michelle Sunwell is on the call. She had asked, Michelle, correct me, or feel free to jump in if I don't ask this to the same level of detail, but she was wanting to know that now that it's been published, if you can add something else, what is it that you wish could be in there that might have to wait for a second edition to get in there?
Thanks for that question, Michelle. I think the biggest thing that I ran out of time, and it's ironic because it was the main intent in writing the book. I wanted my book to kind of be an updated of McKinney's Diagnosis and Correction of the Vocal Faults, which is a wonderful book. I wanted to write it in a way that was clearer. I don't mean that to be unkind, but like if you have to look up something, you kind of have to look for it. And so that's what I wanted my book to be. And so I wanted to write a chapter specifically on vocal faults that are common, vibrato issues, a wide vibrato or a fast vibrato, or an elevated larynx, stridency in the voice, right? What are some other really common things that we deal with every day in the studio? And a lot of,
localized tension, a lot of the, jaw and tongue issues.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, and those are they are in my book, right? There's a whole section, as some of you know, on starting on page 168. I have it memorized because I talk about it so much. The jaw stretches unvoiced, and then the jaw exercises voiced, and then the tongue stretches unvoiced, and the tongue exercises voiced. And so that is inherent in those exercises, the hope that the articulatory system will be able to have greater independence. But there are some specific vocal faults like the vibrato that I don't talk about anywhere in the book. And so that's what I would like to do in this second book is I've got a list going somewhere of things that I come across more frequently and how I would talk about them, what exercises I would either pull out from the book that are there already and put in a specific section for that. And I know I don't use the word vocal fault, and I've said it 10 times in the last 30 seconds. I tend to say vocal challenges instead. And there's probably somebody that has an even better phrase than that, but so a vocal challenge. So that for sure is something I'd like to do. And I've come up with a few other exercises that have had really profound impacts that didn't make it in the book that have come about in the last couple of years. So I'll probably add some of those. Maybe something about working with a singer with an injured voice, just because that work is so near and dear to my heart. Just a very small chapter about how you might take these exercises and modify them if you are somebody that does work on a voice team with singers with injuries. So perhaps something about that.
I love that. Thank you. I love your book, and
thank you,
I
Michelle.
love voice challenges. I think that's a great word to use instead of other words like this is hard.
Yeah.
Hard has a big block, but challenge is a great word. And I'd love to hear more about vibrato issues. That would be wonderful. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'll look forward to hearing the next phase.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll tell you right off my favorite for vibrato. I think I mentioned it in the book. It has the ball where you lean into you put it at the xiphoid process area and lean into the doorway, but also just taking your fingers right at this area because of those points of attachment, the respiratory system. And I find with wobbles or bleats that digging in on that area, the voice just almost immediately alters its oscillation pattern. So that's actually my very favorite.
That's great.
Yeah. My other new favorite, I'll just share with everybody because I just have loved it so much, is it. And I got it from looking at, I had some singers with pathologies, with a paresis, and the voice would literally shut down at about A5, G5, soprano. And I've got great video of this. In fact, I may use it at the NATS conference in July. And the voice would just lock down. You could hear that, all this rise up. And so I was looking at some anatomy books. I thought, gosh, okay, what if, and you take all 4 fingers under the jawbone on both sides, and you go straight up so that the fingernails are touching the inside of the jawbone. Now, not enough that it, like right now, it's changing my voice in a weird way. So not that hard, and you don't want to press in at all, but you go straight up and they immediately, the larynx just settles down as they're singing a high note. You can hear the voice just open up. And the cueing, of course, me and cueing is critical. But all four fingers, there's of course the hyoglossus muscle under there that's, interior, but of course you have the suprahyoids also, right? The mylohyoid digastrics, where you've got those suprahyoid muscles in there. And it just, I think I give Marcy Rosenberg credit for this, because I wanted to check out my thinking. I had this, hunchpothesis, thanks Ian for that word, about what I might be impacting and why that was working for my singers. And even for belters, it works really, really well. But again, the cueing is critical, that it's all four fingers straight up under the jawbone, and you'll just feel this relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of my new favorites.
Ooh, I like that trick. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun.
Great.
Fun when you hear the results.
Yeah. Well, language is loaded, right? And that's why cueing is so important. That's why we avoid certain words, that maybe imply greater level of difficulty or might get in the way of facilitation. So there was a quote on page 15 where you talked about the dynamic relationship between the voice teacher and the singer, and how it's complex, but it requires empathy, compassion, and intuition. And I really like that, empathy, compassion, and intuition. We could dissect each of those words, but the intuition component, I feel like, because there are things that work, or that sometimes we stumble across that maybe we can't always explain why they worked. And this is why I don't like when people refer to technical aspects as a bag of tricks, right? It's like, well, actually, no, but sometimes we do run into things that work and we don't know. And maybe we've stumbled on it because we're just following our gut to do something. But this is what I really like about the way you divide the chapters also, is you give the anatomy, physiology, function, all of that, but then you boil it down to the teacher takeaways. And so I feel like, this is what you really need to know about that, even if you don't remember the names of all the muscles or exact, locations of the formants.
No.
Trying to memorize those. They're approximate. But intuition can also be informed, right? So it's not just following your gut, but it's like informing so that you can make really, really well educated guesses. And sometimes we're guessing, but if it's a science informed, if it's educated, then tuition can still be informed, can it not?
That's a great distinction, and that needs to be altered in my second edition, right? Because it isn't just, I intuit, but I've gone out and played some golf, so now I should start teaching golf because I had a good game, right? That's not what I mean by intuition. You're right. It's intuition that's informed by years and years of study, both as a singer and a teacher. And the teacher part is not just that I have experience as a singer and I've taken my own lessons. It's the actual ability and process of being able to teach another person what you want them to learn. And that the ability to teach is its own training. That's why we still have this thing in our profession where people have had this phenomenal career and they're phenomenal singers, famous singers, and then they start teaching. Does that make them we don't want to qualify it, but if somebody else has spent their life actually learning how to teach, then they're going to be more experienced at that process than somebody who's simply been doing it. So I think there's yes, there's a lot that goes into this idea of intuition, and it comes from years and years of practice and study.
Right.
Mm-hmm. One of the most profound experiences for me is, some of you may know, I, along with my colleagues at the University of Washington, started a multidisciplinary conference in 2016. This will be our 7th year, this May 13th and 14th. And Ingo was one of our keynotes, along with Lynn Helding the first year, and Christine Tanner from University of Utah. And I was sitting next to Ingo, and I had brought one of my friends, Michaela Martins, who sings at the Met and all over the world. And we brought her out as the master teacher, and she gave a stunning recital for us. And I said, okay, Ingo, this is my vision for this master class. I want her to work with the student, and then I want you to get up and tell us what just happened scientifically. And I'll never forget this, you know, how kind he is. And he looked at me, and he who was always enthusiastic, I could tell was a little resistant, but he didn't say anything. So I was sitting next to him, and I said, okay, so when she gets done with this, because I felt like, well, Ingo Titze, you know, brilliant voice scientist of the world, is going to be able to explain to us what's going on. And I couldn't wait, because when I would teach, I would think, what would Ingo, like, what would be the answer, or what would be the information? So anyway, he looked at me and he leaned over and said, oh gosh, I'm not going to remember his exact words, but basically it was like, this is beyond the science. Like, these are the, yes, I wish I should ask him sometime to write down, because it was really succinct and eloquent, but it basically just said, this is, unless I have machinery hooked up to this singer, it's not like I can just with my ears now tell you scientifically what's going on. Right. He's a man of science. There's going to be measures. It's not going to be some ambiguous subjective conversation, right? But it was such a profound moment for me to hear from him that these are my words now, but there is a component of magic in all this. We can guess, we can surmise, right? Why does this thing work? This new one that I'm doing, Marcy and I discussed it in detail, what muscles what we were doing to which muscles. And we discussed it in great detail, and we kind of go, okay, well, it works. And so we can make educated assumptions, but there is something that we do that is magic.
Right.
When they find that magic moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
art. It's still an art, and you know, we don't. The goal is to not come out of performances and say, "My, what efficient singing we just witnessed!" Right? We want to be emotionally moved, and
yes,
we want to feel changed. And science is definitely a tool in getting us there, but it's obviously not the be-all, end-all. And I think
yes.
I'm certain Ingo would agree with that.
And I do want to say, I have to be very careful, because I love the minutia of all of this, you know, the application and the specificity and thinking systematically, and it is to enable artistry. I mean, that is the point. I do think that as voice teachers, though, I feel that my primary job is that technique, so that they find their artistry. And there are other places for them to help. There are acting coaches, and, you know, we don't get much time with them. We can't do all of it. So I definitely do feel very strongly that this is how I can empower. I'm going to continue to use that word, help my students empower themselves with this knowledge, and so that they can then go and explore their own art, their artistry. And I guide that to some degree, but this is where I live. And I know that there are teachers that I really respect tremendously, and I read posts frequently that will say, you can't talk about the mechanics of breathing, right? And I with all due respect, I could not disagree more. I think that, yes, at some point it is a full body, you know, you have to just allow, right, at some point. But I do think that you can teach breath mechanics separate. They have to be coordinated with phonation at some point. But a football player has got to learn how to hold the football. You can't just have a coach say, okay, aim for that and go.
Right.
At some point, there are mechanics about the physics of how the arm is going to best operate to maximize the distance, how the hand is going to be held. I'm making this up. I have no idea how to throw a football, but right. And so I think that the same thing that I think we must actually. So I really feel very strongly that we must. And then at some point, then you give a task or a tool. Like I love the Laban My dear friend Frank Ragsdale will be doing a session on that at NATS, the Laban method of movement, and you can facilitate this incredible change in the singers' voices, right? But I still want them to be able to understand some semblance of the mechanics of that.
Right. Yeah. Janela is asking about the yeah. Oh, and then we're getting some of that.
Yeah,
Mostly are they all in Lynn's column, the cognitive or the?
they are. They're at the NATS, and you can find them on my website as well. EBVP, the first one is out there, and it's just called Defining Evidence-Based Voice Pedagogy. Lynn Maxfield in mine, component 1, and Ken Bozeman in mine, component 2 is out there. Lynn Helding in mine I'm not sure, it's coming out soon. Maybe in the next journal, in the next one of the next 2 journals. So you can find them at the NATS website in their journal, or you can find them on my website. They're under publications. I have a whole bunch of articles that I've written. And somebody else, one article is, yeah, yes, that's the original. Yep. Yes. Thanks. Thank you, Carolina.
And diagram.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. That is the page.
Right. Well, as we start to wrap this up here, some of these last couple of questions that I had sent to you, because we all have to be sort of masters of all. We have to know a little bit about everything, but I think we also generally have specific skills that we're particularly good or effective with. And so I'm wondering if there were chapters in the book that came more easily for you, and other chapters where you maybe had to go back and check some of your resources and hone up a little bit before you could write it to the same level as the chapters that you felt more comfortable with.
Yes, you would have seen me with resources constantly. There were none that flowed easily. And in fact, the 24 hours before I submitted, I completely reworked chapter 1 and chapter 2. And took sections of 1 and put in another. I mean, I completely reorganized those 2 chapters at D-Day, which was my sister, God bless her, helped me through that. And I would say that the 2 sections that really stand out to me is challenging but satisfying. The SOVT section in the phonation chapter was not originally planned, and it's one of the sections I'm most proud of, because you hear so much about SOVTs, but nobody had compiled it in this way, the way I had laid it out, and then taken it into application. So I feel really, at least that I know of, I'm sorry, there may be somebody that has, but I've not seen it. So I was really proud of that section. And it was, I wanted to be so accurate. So it took, I always give credit to people that have helped me. So Mara Kapsmer Smith, right, was on the other end of phone calls and endless texts and emails, checking my thinking and my language. And Lynn Maxfield received a section of that. And so I had a lot of people checking my work. Writing was very hard for me, that book, because I would have analysis paralysis. Every sentence I would start, and then you'd see a thread on Facebook that was relevant. And I thought, well, if I say that person's going to think that's wrong. And this person's going to, and I really for months was, struggling with that. And then I just thought, I've just got to do my thing, and people are going to poke holes as they see fit. The resonance chapter was the scariest. Ken Bozeman happened to be the keynote at my conference that year and stayed over, and we sat in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon and worked through it together. And, he gave me edits and ideas. And so he was a constant resource. My slide rule, which I love, my slide rule that I came up with, he consulted with me on the language of that. And then, of course, Carrie Obert was on the other side of that resonance. Her and Chadley's work, which hadn't been presented yet, that part in my book had not been presented in that way. And I got some incredible kind comments when Carrie read it the first time. I thought, okay, I'm going to be okay. I just got an incredible comment from her on that chapter. Same with Chadley. So I would say the resonance chapter was the most intimidating, because I did not want to go into the formants and the harmonics. That's not my area. And there are better books that people like Ken who are qualified to write about that, not me. And so how do I write a chapter on resonance and not go there? And so, but I feel like I found a way to present it from an application perspective. And that is what my, desire was. And so I felt like it worked okay. And people can go to the resources of people that are qualified to talk about more depth.
Right.
Yeah. So those would be the toughest sections for sure. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like, as we know, it takes a village to to compile any great task, and you certainly relied on your village of
My
colleagues,
goodness.
both the ones that you cite and the ones that you had review and that you relied upon for vetting and checking and ideas. But you also, I love that you dedicate the book to your students, which is the other side of the village, and that's why we're all here. And so a source like this that impacts teachers impacts such a wider village of students. So we all thank you, and our students thank you for this wonderful resource as well, how it has impacted our teaching and what it has brought to the vocal world.
Well, Brian, and I cannot thank you. I just want to say on the record, because Brian had asked me to speak to the book club, and then he let me completely hijack the idea to this, because I had been thinking about it for a year for one of the year anniversaries, and then went above and beyond with great depth of work and time at a very busy academic time in your year to ask such insightful questions. So I really thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm honored, really honored.
It was my pleasure, and many of our book club folks are here today.
Oh,
So
good. Oh, wonderful.
we're
Well, I hope to see people in, I was going to say Canada, but I meant Chicago.
Chicago.
I hope to see people at the NATS conference. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Kari. Thank you, everyone,
you.
for being here, spending part of your Saturday, and keep reading.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
We'll
Kari.
see you soon. Bye-bye.